So welcome to the second graduate lecture series. This is the second of four. This lecture is essentially on systematic literature review, what it is, and how to write a systematic literature review. Let us begin with a prayer by asking God's blessing for this activity. So after the prayer, we will have our Savior hymn. So pray with us and sing with us with the Savior hymn. Let's pray.
Let us put ourselves in the presence of the Lord. Our Heavenly Father, we offer you our thanksgiving. We thank you for everyone gathered here today to walk with you. May we ask you for your blessings and guidance so that the activities set for this undertaking be successful. We ask you to open our eyes to see the wonderful things from this activity. We ask that you open our ears so that we may retain the invaluable knowledge. Open our minds for us to think wisely. Put us with understanding, cooperation, and peace in fulfilling our responsibilities. Open our hearts so that we may receive your everlasting love. And open our spirit so that we may know that you are with us all throughout the day. We ask all this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Okay, thank you very much. That's our Savior hymn. May we formally welcome again Dr. Andrea. That's our Savior hymn, Savior University hymn. In the chat room, in the Zoom room, we have 85 participants or 86, and we have graduate students and faculty and also administrators. May I ask the graduate students to raise their hand, please? If you are a graduate student, may I ask you to raise your hand, please? Good morning. Okay, thank you very much. Conan, Karen, Adams, okay, Mr. Gary, okay, Roy, okay, thank you very much. Mia, okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you for taking the time. Okay, thank you. We have also graduate faculty. Your teachers are also here. Can I also ask our faculty to give a thumbs up? To our faculty, Dr. Linda, Dr. Wayne Escol, Ma'am Bambi, Ma'am Tolod, Dr. Tolod. Okay, thank you. A thumbs up, please, to from our faculty. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much again for coming. May I formally welcome and introduce Dr. Andrea Martinez. So Dr. Andrea is based in London, and again, in London it may be 1:14 a.m. So thank you, Dr. Andrea. So Dr. Andrea is an assistant professor at the Department of Behavioral Science in the University of Philippines, Manila. She finished her bachelor's degree in behavioral science in UP Manila and her master's degree in special education in UP Diliman. She obtained a master's in philosophy and is a PhD psychology candidate at King's College London. Miss Andrea serves in various capacities as volunteer, consultant, and member of the Board of Trustees in several non-government organizations and government agencies for children, women, and social welfare, both in Manila and in London. She also served as resource speaker and trainer in various training programs and forums on mental health for schools, communities, organizations, and government agencies and embassies. Her research interests dealt with issues on mental health and help-seeking behavior, violence against women and children, young person self-harm behavior, and drug use. She served as research manager in the National Baseline Study on Violence Against Children and co-investigator in the Online Child Sexual Abuse and Exploitation Study. Both research projects are funded by the UNICEF. She is also part of the UP research team on behavioral health and addiction problem of young people in Manila and nearby provinces. She published articles in high-impact, peer-reviewed journals on these topics. She also sits as an expert panel on the Technical Committee on Mental Health in the National Institutes of Health Scientific Review Council of UP Manila. Ms. Andrea is awarded Gawad Chancellor Award for Public Service in 2017 and won UP Faculty Award in Public Service in 2016 and 2019. So may I present again and let us welcome Dr. Andrea Martinez, our resource speaker for today. Let us give her a warm virtual applause, please.
Okay, maraming salamat po, Doc Shello. Thank you for that very generous introduction, and thank you for having me here in your webinar on research webinar. Siguro just a bit of correction. I'm not yet a doctor. I wish I am. I'm still, I have to do my Viva Voce in January, hoping against hope it would be successful. So again, maraming salamat po for having me today in your webinar, and it's really my honor to be part of your capacity building, especially in terms of research, which is really what the country needed for all of our development efforts. So should I be starting? Okay. I'll just be sharing my screen. Okay, so I hope you see my screen. Okay, so when Doc Shello invited me to speak on the topic on literature review, I actually have to ask if we can narrow it down to systematic review, because this is something that for one, I'm passionate about, and second, for me, I think this is one thing I could easily talk about, because in my first year of doing my PhD here in the UK, the first thing I was asked to do is a systematic review. And this is something that is actually most master students and even PhD students are required to do in the UK, because this is part of gathering evidence. This is part of the evidence-based research, especially if the research project is about developing intervention. So today I'll be explaining how to do a systematic review, how to write, and of course, hopefully how to translate it into a publication. So As a start, I'd like to start with this quote. Research is to see what everybody else has seen and to think what nobody else has thought about. Yeah, well, almost everybody has seen something, right? But to see it from a different perspective, that is actually something that research can do. And research is very helpful, very relevant for healthcare providers, consumers, researchers, policymakers, and all other consumers out there, especially with the advent of information technology. Okay, so we probably are inundated with unmanageable amount of information, and it's really quite important that we are able to synthesize all this available evidence. Especially, by the way, I'll be mostly talking about healthcare because that is also my field. So, for today's learning outcomes, so first and foremost, for us to define systematic review and identify the different key characteristics of what systematic review is, and differentiate it from other forms of literature review. Systematic review is not often done in the Philippines, when actually it is one of the highest form of evidence, especially in healthcare research. And then, of course, to identify the key steps in doing systematic review and evaluate the merits of doing systematic review. Hold on, I just need to charge my... Okay, so I hope I'm audible enough. Edible, sorry. Yeah, I'm audible enough and you can hear me, right? Okay, so just probably some bits of what's this of not really rules, but probably behavioral contracts. So if you need to ask question, just feel free to unmute yourselves or put in chat, although I may not be able to read the chat, so probably Doc Raisha can monitor the chat for some questions. Or you can raise your hand. Yeah, if you need to ask questions, feel free to interrupt me anytime. And given probably the limited time that we have, I could only cover the tip of of doing systematic review, because it requires really probably extensive time to discuss everything and every aspect of the process of doing systematic review. If you need to share something, feel free to share. And also my policy or my belief is that there is no such thing as a stupid question. So, because some students I know, especially for students, they are so shy to ask questions thinking that, oh, I might sound stupid, but there's no such thing as stupid questions. So you can ask anything. Of course, those related to our topic. So there, yeah. Okay, now let's define what systematic review is. I hope, please don't fall asleep on me today. Okay, so systematic review, as I've said, is actually one of the highest form of evidence available. So this is basically literature review, but later I'll discuss how it differs from other literature review. The idea or the reason why we do systematic review is to locate, appraise, synthesize the best available evidence. Meaning to say, as I've said earlier, because of too many information out there, sometimes the difficulty is to synthesize which of this information are really good evidence to wherein to base certain decisions, especially decisions such as intervention in healthcare. Okay, so the idea, as I've said, is to provide informative and evidence-based answers to certain research questions. So in systematic review, like any other research, there is always the research question that needs to be answered. So we have to, and because there is a research question that needs to be answered, and therefore there are certain pre-specified eligibility criteria that we have to consider in doing systematic review. So when I say eligibility criteria, it means certain criteria in which the different studies. Okay, so in literature review, we read and synthesize studies, right? But in systematic review, we have a predefined criteria on what to include, what studies to include. Okay, I'll emphasize more on that later on. So the very reason why it's called systematic, meaning that the methods we use to search and analyze the data are, of course, transparent, meaning to say we have to actually report this in our in the manuscript, and of course it's reproducible, meaning to say that if another researcher would have to use the method you use in your research, he would come up with the same result. And of course, it is defined before the searching could ever begin. Okay, so kaya nga systematic, it's unlike any other probably literature review wherein you just get in or take in any available literature out there. But in systematic review, we have to follow a step-by-step process. Okay, this image shows the different levels of evidence required. And how these levels of evidence are mapped out actually into the existing information out there. So, but by the way, please understand that this pyramid is mainly on focus on research on medical and social sciences and the different types of literature out there. So if you notice, higher up in the pyramid is actually the amount of available literature on a given topic, which decreases. But of course, even if there are not so many available information on that, it means that the relevance and the quality of that literature increases. So therefore, that's why in the pyramid, on top of the pyramid are systematic reviews and meta-analysis, because they are considered to be of the highest quality evidence on a research topic, primarily because their study design reduces the bias and produces more reliable findings. Okay, so that's why we always say that systematic reviews are considered actually the best or the gold standard way to synthesize findings of several studies, especially if we are, of course, looking at different questions and whether it comes from, not just from healthcare actually. Recently, systematic reviews have been used in education, in governance, in social sciences, of course, in healthcare profession as well, and many other disciplines. Yeah, I've mentioned about doing a systematic review. So I did this systematic review on help-seeking behavior of Filipinos and the different barriers they face. This has been published in High Impact Journal, and I probably am proud to say, because my supervisor kept on saying, "Oh, your literature, your systematic review is well cited." So the idea is that in any systematic review, we want to provide a comprehensive and, of course, unbiased synthesis of a very large amount of relevant studies. Of course, relevant studies, meaning to say they answer your research question. So there are three aspects or three reasons why we do systematic reviews. They say that we consider actually systematic review as the pillar of evidence-based healthcare. In fact, the very word evidence-based medicine was coined sometime early 1990s, and this is basically geared or collated from systematic search, in which the goal was to guide teaching and practice of clinical medicine. So first, of course, systematic reviews are used for clinical guidelines, especially for example, if we want to identify, for instance, what intervention work best for, say, the treatment of a particular illness or particular disease. So it can give us a guideline on which of those randomized controlled trial, for example, putting them together into a systematic review really work best. Okay. Second is to appraise the clinical practice. uncover all available international evidence, because the good thing about systematic review, unlike, for example, one study of an RCT can be confined in one laboratory. However, the systematic review would cover worldwide evidence that have been published on a certain topic. And then, of course, it can also guide policy development, not only in clinical decision making, but also in other disciplines. Okay. So what makes systematic review actually different from other forms of literature is because of its key characteristics. First, it has its own objectives. As I've said, we do systematic review to answer a particular research question. And within that particular research question, we define the eligibility criteria for the studies to be included in the systematic review. Second, there is an explicit reproducible methodology. So we follow a very rigorous, strict step-by-step process in doing the systematic review. And then third, we do systematic search. We try to uncover all the available evidence out there and identify which sources of evidence, or when I say evidence, literature, are we going to use. And then, of course, not only that, we do quality assessment of the validity of the findings of this evidence. So we do not just search for the evidence, but we actually assess the quality of this evidence, whether they meet certain standards. And of course, we present and synthesize this evidence. Okay, hold on. I think I'm not charging. Sorry, it's not. Wait, give me a minute, sorry. Yeah, the perils of doing online. Okay, so there. Now, I would not go into the detail of discussing the difference between systematic review and the different types of literature review, but probably just for again, for expounding what systematic review is, we have to contextualize it by comparing it with other literature review. So a literature review is actually a piece of academic writing for most of you, especially the fact that you have you're in your postgraduate, and I suppose you understand that one of the requirements in getting a degree is to engage in an academic writing. So, and part of that, of course, is doing a literature review. The idea is to demonstrate our knowledge and understanding of a specific topic within the context of the different literature available out there. Okay, so in literature review, we do critical evaluation of the different studies of the material. It's not just a literature report and not just a form of essay writing, but rather we try to answer certain questions around our research. In systematic review, it's more comprehensive and more precise because unlike literature review, it has its specific scientific questions that need to be answered. Okay. When comparing it with narrative review, so narrative review, the main objective is actually to formulate a well-defined research question. We use both qualitative and quantitative methods to analyze available evidence in systematic review, by the way, whereas in narrative review, we can address one or more questions in a broader scope. So meaning to say, we do narrative review in a much broader, comprehensive scale, whereas in systematic review, we try to answer a specific questions such as how effective is, say, cognitive behavior therapy in the treatment of depression among adolescents. So, yeah. There are other types of literature review. We also have what we call rapid review and scoping review. So, rapid review is some sort of a systematic review, but this is done in a very short time frame. wherein we probably just do rapid review of available evidence in one database. Say, for example, you're doing a rapid review of literature on, say, cognitive behavior therapy that is available in, say, ProQuest or available in PsycInfo database. Okay. Scoping review is actually a relatively new approach in evidence synthesis. Okay, so they are also similar to systematic reviews because they also followed a protocol. The difference is that scoping review is meant to identify knowledge gaps, and sometimes scoping review is done as sort of a prelude to systematic review, to a full-blown systematic review. So there's really not much difference, except, as I've said, systematic review is more methodological, and that there are certain criteria needed to be included for the studies to be included in systematic review. So let's have an overview of the different steps in doing systematic review, and later I would expound on them. First, of course, we have to plan our review. Okay, we normally it takes like 9 months to 1 year to do systematic review, including, of course, the writing of the protocol and the writing of the manuscript. Second is we do the scoping search. So I've mentioned about scoping review. We can carry out searches initially to identify the background, and so we can refine the review or research questions that we have in mind. And of course, to set our inclusion-exclusion criteria of studies that will be included in the systematic review. Then we search the literature, and in searching for the literature, we have to do it in a systematic way. Unlike, of course, when we do just any other literature review, in whatever, kumbaga, whatever comes, like, okay, so I'll search Google Scholar, or I'll search Ovid, or whatever database I'll search. But in searching for literature in systematic review, it has to be done systematically. And then we screen the titles and abstracts, so we can identify which of the literature or studies would be included. And that's only when we obtain the full text paper of the evidence we identify. And of course, in obtaining the full paper, we have to read and of course extract the evidence or the data. Okay, so once we have obtained the full text paper, there is another set of screening that we have to do, because we also have to apply another set of inclusion-exclusion criteria. Then we extract the data, as I've said, and then we assess the quality of the full text paper, whether the paper would have met the standards we set for methodological rigors and assessment criteria that we have set so far. And then, of course, we do the analysis and the synthesis. There are different ways of doing data analysis of systematic reviews. And we, of course, write up, edit, and disseminate. I would emphasize on the idea of disseminating your findings, because unfortunately, when we do, for example, theses, especially for postgraduate students, they just sit in the collection of the National Library or in the library of your university. It's really quite important that we aim to publish our research, our theses. Okay. Now let's go over these steps and what are some of the different, probably some tips that I could share on how to engage in each of these steps. Okay, as I've said, we have to plan for doing a systematic review. It has to start, of course, with a protocol. So a protocol is sort of a research proposal, and we have to follow that protocol all throughout. There are also, I would also recommend that you try to have a collaborator for doing your systematic review. when I did my systematic review, I was asked to collaborate with another PhD student who was also doing a systematic review, because we have to help each other in terms of screening the article, in terms of assessing the quality of the articles that we have chosen and all that. So it's really quite important you have potential collaborators. Okay, so like any other research, it starts with a review question or a research question. Okay, we just call it review question because we are doing systematic review, as I've said. First, like any other research, you have to identify what topic area of interest to you. Okay, you can start doing scoping research, meaning to say for example, you're thinking of doing research on mental health. So what are the available evidence on mental health? Okay, I'll do a systematic review. The first way to identify whether there has been a systematic review that has been done on your topic of interest is to check Prospero. So Prospero is one of those databases and also register of systematic reviews that are being done and has been done in different fields. In fact, for example, the systematic review I did, I was required by my university to register it in Prospero. And then we have to focus our ideas to define the scope of the review. Okay, it would be best to do a mind map. For example, the word mental health might be very broad. So which aspect of mental health would you like to focus on? So say, for example, you'd like to focus on culturally adapted intervention for mental health program of, say, a specific group of people. You may want to find out if there had been studies conducted on that topic. Okay, so we can do preliminary search. Okay, and then based on your review question, you can develop your inclusion-exclusion criteria, or what we call eligibility criteria. When we do like first-hand research or primary research, for example, you're doing say descriptive study, you also identify the eligibility criteria for your participants, right? However, in systematic review, our participants, quote unquote, are the different studies or the different literature available out there. So we have to identify the inclusion-exclusion criteria of those literature review that would be included in our systematic review. Okay, you can also contact experts. I did part of that when I was doing my systematic review. I contacted 2 experts in the Philippines to sort of check on them what has been done on this topic. And of course, you need to write your review protocol. This review protocol, you can, as I've said, you can register in Prospero. Okay. So there are different types of review questions that we can do. It could be descriptive review question. So similar to any research methodology that you can use. So descriptive question is when you are presenting a concept. For example, you'd like to do a systematic review on what are the barriers and facilitators of help seeking for mental health among Filipino migrants. So that's a descriptive review question. Could also be normative, wherein we explore our preferences about what should happen. So say, for example, the review question could be, how do mental health professionals perceive the care delivery issues relating to access of services? Okay, because probably when you are talking about delivery issues, then there are certain standards or preferences you'd want to accomplish. The review question could also be relational, meaning you want to investigate the relationship between 2 or more variables. So say, for example, you may want to ask question about, so what is the reported relationship between barriers to help seeking and attitudes towards help seeking for mental health? Could also be causal or causation question, wherein we want to investigate the effect of 1 or more independent variables to 1 or more outcome variable. Okay, for example, question like, what have been shown to be the most effective programs for improving help seeking? And it could be theoretical questions, such as exploring factors that can cause a condition. So say, for example, theoretical questions such as what adaptive elements could explain the effectiveness of say, mental health intervention for migrants. So you can actually make use of the following when doing formulating your review question. We have, for example, we have to identify the review questions based on the following elements. Could be PCOS, okay? What is your population of interest? What intervention are you looking at? What's the comparator? Are you using, for example, say, treatment as usual? What's the outcome? What study design of the different literatures are you including? What is the setting? Is it a clinical setting, community-based setting, etc.? Or it could be PIO or PEO, depending on what method you are using. I will not go into the detail of this, but probably just a way of introduction. So say, for example, PICO is used for doing literature review on clinical questions. Or if you're using say, mixed method, you want to do both quantitative and qualitative analysis, so you can use the acronym SPICE or SPIDER in formulating your research questions. So what's the sample, the phenomenon of interest, the design, evaluation, the research type. Okay, so or FINER or PCC, marami po yan. I could provide you with the sources for this. Or if you're doing qualitative study, say, for example, in your systematic review, you'd be doing narrative synthesis, then you can use PEO or PICO. So for example, population and their problems, who are the service users of a particular program, who are the practitioners, if you are, say, for example, investigating the effectiveness of doing cognitive behavior therapy, what's the setting, the exposure, such as the condition or illness or risk factor you are investigating, and of course the outcomes, whether it's an attitude, it's a feeling you are trying to understand, whether it pertains to say, mobility problem, responsiveness to treatment, and all that. Or whether you are doing systematic review on quantitative studies. So there is also the PICO, PICO, and PIFT. And then, marami pong, kumbaga, there are different ways in different helpful standards in which we can use to formulate our review question. So once we have formulated our review question, okay, the next thing to do is to define the inclusion-exclusion criteria of our review question. So inclusion or the eligibility criteria describe, of course, the specific of the study, so that they would be included in the review. For example, you can identify in your inclusion criteria what study design. So I'll only be doing systematic review on, say, RCTs, or I'll only be doing systematic reviews on, say, descriptive studies or cohort studies, or a particular study design. You can also specify the date of the publication. So say, for example, you're doing systematic review on those RCTs that have been conducted since 2011 to present. Okay, because probably there was a systematic review conducted in the same topic, say 10 years ago, and you want to update that systematic review. Could also be the language of the publication, such as including studies that are only published in English. Okay, or it could be the publication type and any other inclusion criteria. Exclusion criteria, on the other hand, describes the specific attributes that would disqualify a study from inclusion in the review. Okay, so similar to other inclusion-exclusion criteria, the exclusion criteria is not the opposite, just the opposite of inclusion criteria. Okay, they are often mutually exclusive. So minsan, what I noticed for most research proposals, when they identify the exclusion criteria, is the opposite of inclusion criteria. So not necessarily. Okay, so say for example, exclusion criteria would include studies that are, say, multi-ethnic and does not disaggregate the different ethnicities. Okay, so that can be an exclusion criteria. The exclusion criteria could also follow the PCOS. So say you inclusion exclusion criteria, say you can identify your inclusion exclusion criteria in terms of population, in terms of the intervention, study design. I've mentioned all of this. Okay. Again, it would help you focus your review question, make it more specific instead of making it very broad. That's the reason why we identified the inclusion exclusion criteria. Okay. There are certain instances, by the way, wherein some systematic reviews would only focus on, say, for example, the use of English in the publication. Sometimes it can create publication bias. So as much as possible, if you know other language and you know that there are studies that have been published in your language, I would suggest to not to limit your inclusion exclusion criteria to published articles in English. Okay, so this is an example of inclusion exclusion criteria using the PCOS. Yeah, and when you have identified your inclusion exclusion criteria, you have to stick to it because you would have to report this in your in your systematic review. And at the same time, it would guide you all throughout the process of the systematic review. For example, this is my PhD thesis. So what's the evidence for mental health literacy as intervention to improve help-seeking behavior of migrant domestic workers? So the population of interest would be migrant domestic workers. Unfortunately, it's kind of limited. So eventually I had to expand it not only to London, because apparently I found out that there's no study yet on migrant domestic workers in London or in the UK. So I have to make it worldwide. The intervention would be mental health literacy. And then eventually I also had to expand it because apparently there is no intervention that has been done yet around 2018 when I did my systematic review. And then the stated intervention compared with other intervention, or it could be just no intervention given. The outcomes like help-seeking behavior, barriers to help-seeking, or facilitators of help-seeking. And then I have to identify that I'm not into specific study designs, but I would include all study designs as long as it is about migrant workers. And eventually, as I've said, so I had to expand it not only to migrant workers, but to Filipinos all throughout. So this is an example of my inclusion exclusion criteria. As I've said, you would have to report this because that, unlike any other literature review, when we do literature review as part of our thesis, we don't have to report the eligibility criteria we use to identify the studies that we are using for literature review, right? But in systematic review, we have to be transparent on the eligibility criteria because, again, the idea is that other researchers, if they do your method, they would come up with the same results. So say, for example, my inclusion criteria includes those studies that address either formal or help-seeking or attitude, or those that employ any study design, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or mixed method. whereas my exclusion criteria includes those studies in which problems that prompted them to engage in help seeking are medical, okay, and not something psychological or academic or career-based. Because when I did my scoping review, I realized that, for example, there was a study conducted on help seeking, but it's not about mental health help seeking, but rather on general medical problems. So I have to exclude those studies. You have to include the inclusion-exclusion criteria in your protocol, okay? So as I've said, your protocol can help define the clear objectives of the review and eventually could guide you in your review. It also helps in preventing duplication of research by other researchers. Say, for example, if you register your review protocol in say, Prospero, there you would be able to identify if there are other reviews that have been done, conducted, or ongoing in your topic. We use Prisma. Later, I will explain what Prisma is. So yeah, there are different protocol registry sites. I'm just familiar with Prospero. That's why I'm not really endorsing, but I'm as I've said, I'm just familiar with this. But you can also use Campbell Collaboration, Open Science Framework, Research Registry. I would encourage you to register. This is also something that most Filipinos are not inclined to do. Sometimes we do research without really like thinking of registering it in protocol registry. Now, with the advent of too many research proposals out there, and especially if your goal is to publish it eventually, sometimes journals would ask you ano yung registry number mo on that, say on a particular protocol site. So it's a good practice, that's one. And second, it's also one way in which you can disseminate your research already and be proud of your research if you try to register it. I just like to share, like the other day, I have some friends in the Philippines who contacted me and asked, oh, would you like to join our research? We're doing this research, blah, blah, blah. And then apparently they've already started with gathering of the data and the evidences. And I said, oh, where's the research proposal? And they said, oh yeah, but we've already started doing interviews and gathering surveys. And I was like, you cannot do a research without a research proposal, because the research proposal is supposed to be your guide, your blueprint for doing research. So yeah, we have to do this practice of registering our protocol. Okay, so once we have the review questions, we have identified the eligibility or the inclusion criteria, then we can develop the search strategy. As I've said, searching is really like a comprehensive term, an umbrella term that can actually describe so many methods in which we can identify the studies or the evidence relevant to our review question. Unlike other literature review, most of the time when we do literature review, okay, I'll go to the library or I'll go to Google Scholar to search the literatures out there. But in systematic review, the search strategy has to be also identified and done systematically. So just probably to signpost you to the different potential sources of your published literature, so you can consider the type of evidence, whether they are published literature or gray literature, the bibliographic database that you will use, because you also have to report this in your systematic review, the key search terms that we use, we also have to report this. And if we are using complementary searching tools such as hand searching or citation chaining. Okay, so in published literature, so these are usually those evidence or studies from commercial publishers. Okay, that's why we call it published literature. Say peer-reviewed journals or academic books. Okay, so they can be found in bibliographic databases or volumes of specialist journals or reference lists from retrieved articles, even newspaper archives. It has its pros and cons. For one, it's easier to locate because most of the time when you, for example, use Google Scholar, okay, all the published literature are there. Or say you're using Ovid or other database. It's also easier to systematically and transparently search. And of course, you can report the results in your thesis, and you can easily also make use of reference management software. So especially, for example, because you need to eventually do the citation. So madali siyang ilipat sa reference software. And most of the time, of course, published literature are peer-reviewed, which means that in terms of the quality of the study or the paper, they meet certain standards. Okay. However, of course, one limitation is that the data might be limited, and there could be risk of publication bias. Risk of publication bias because, of course, most of the published literature are in English. And of course, many of them are conducted in, say, yung tinatawag nating weird countries, Western, educated, industrialized, resource-rich, quote-unquote, democratic countries. And very seldom would they include, for example, studies from low-income countries. But of course, if you will include published literature, for example, in the Philippines, then that would be great. For example, in my systematic review, I had to include published literature in the Philippines. The only limitation I had then was that most of the published literature in the Philippines are not yet in the web, not yet in the internet. So it's kind of limited physically. You can also make use of gray literature. Sometimes you can also identify this as part of your eligibility criteria. So this could be thesis, dissertation, conference paper. It could be research data, say, for example, in a laboratory, clinical trials that have not been published yet, or diaries and letters of researchers, company records, many other. One good thing about gray literature is that they reduce the publication bias, and of course, you are allowed access to a diverse evidence out there. And unlike published literature, most of the time published literature have limited word count. For example, it was kind of difficult for me to publish one of my studies, which was qualitative studies, because even if it was a qualitative study, and you could expect that it is verbose, it is like thousands of words, but most publication or most journals would only allow you to have like 5,000, 8,000 words. So you're kind of limited to what evidence to present. However, in gray literature, of course, the publication or the studies are not limited by word count. The difficulty, of course, is that they are hard to locate. Okay, of course, we are not clear about whether they have been peer reviewed. And then, of course, it's difficult to report methods in the thesis. But as I've said, you can also include them. In my systematic review, I have to do away with the gray literature because, as I've said, I didn't have the resources to engage in gray literature review. Okay, also in doing your search strategy, we have to, okay, so there's a question, what is the minimum number of literatures to be reviewed? We'll go into that. There's no minimum number. Minimum number, sorry, I thought maximum. The minimum number, I was told by my supervisor that if you have 2 studies, that can be used for literature, for systematic review. So yeah, the minimum would be 2. Of course, it would be difficult to do systematic review if it's just 1. So 2 or 3 studies, you can already conduct systematic review. Okay, and then we identify keywords. Yeah, sometimes this is where most of us would probably have problems with, like, we don't know what, while we know what topic we are working on or the review question, sometimes the keywords would not lead us to a number of studies, or sometimes naman yung keywords are too broad na you'd be inundated by thousands of studies in the register. So we have to identify it properly. And then of course we have to measure, we have to balance between being comprehensive and precise. So I have here very brief videos on how to do the searching techniques using, for example, how to identify keywords, how to do truncation, or how to do phrase searching, what are the Boolean words that we can use. So let me play the video for a while. Wait, I have. Okay.
We often search for information on more than one idea. Say we want to find information on communication and nursing. We're not interested in these ideas on their own, but where they overlap. In databases, we join ideas using the command AND. AND narrows your search. Now let's take a look at the word communication. Communication has many synonyms and related terms. We can use the command OR to expand our search for communication to include listening or eye contact. This returns results containing at least one of these terms. Combining words with OR widens your search. Other times we want to remove results, so we use NOT. Be careful with this command as it can remove useful results. Also, when using these commands, use capital letters. As always, head to the library to learn
Okay,
more.
you can use this. We call them Boolean operators. They are very important to get the most appropriate results. And you can use this even when you're searching Google Scholar, for example. Another way of doing systematic search is through the use of truncation. So again, this is a short video on using truncation. Truncation, wildcards, this is a way in which we can use, we can search database in which we truncate the word ending. So for example, instead of using the word nursing, we can probably use just NURS, nurse. So we can include nurse, nursing, etc. So this is a way in which we can do truncation.
Truncation is a way to efficiently broaden your searches and save you time. Let's say you're searching a database and one of your keywords is education. One resource might use the word education, while another uses educator, or educate, or educational, or educating, or any possible plurals. That's a lot to type into the search box. Truncation is a tool that allows you to use a symbol, usually an asterisk, to find these word variations without actually typing each word. In this case, we type educat and add an asterisk. This tells the database to search for all possible words that start with educat but have any ending. This can save you a lot of time. Where you place the asterisk does make a difference. Take biology as an example. Putting the asterisk later in the word can often reduce irrelevant results. As always, head to the library to learn more.
Okay, so that's how we use truncation. As they've said, yeah, normally the symbol used to truncate the word or the phrases, the keywords would be the asterisk. Okay, another technique in searching is the use of phrases, especially if the terms are obviously they belong together. For example, the word mental health, they belong together. Okay.
Phrase searching is a powerful, easy to use tool that will save you time. When searching databases for information, our keywords are often a combination of words like duty of care, eye contact, or artificial intelligence. Typing phrases straight into most databases will search for all of the words, but not necessarily together or in the same order. Putting two or more words within quotation marks locks them into place and tells the database to search for exactly what's between the quotation marks, the exact words and order. This means fewer and more relevant results. That's good news. This also means you have to be careful with spelling. In general, the longer the phrase, the less results you can expect. You can't just put quotation marks around your essay question. Use phrase searching as part of your next search strategy, and as always, head to the library to learn more.
Okay. Yeah, so and also the last would be what we call the search string as another method or another technique for searching.
Developing an effective search string can save you time by returning accurate results faster. A search string is a combination of your keywords, truncation, and Boolean operators. Let's say we want to find information on the impact of stress on primary school teachers. Starting with the word stress, we join synonyms and related terms by using or. Stress or anxiety. Now use parentheses around these words as they all relate to stress. We then add to this search string by using the word and. Let's continue to do the same inside parentheses for other keywords and their synonyms. Take note we use the quotation marks to search for words we want to keep together. Primary school, elementary school. Quotation marks locks words together. Let's continue by using and. In this last group, we use the asterisk to look for more words such as educator, education, teacher, or teaching. And there we have it, a search string. Modify the search string to suit your needs. As always, head to the library to learn more.
Okay, so the reason why we do this or we have to use these techniques is because if we just type in the keywords in, say, for example, in Google, just in Google Scholar, we would be probably inundated with thousands of literature that or studies that it would be difficult to search and it would be difficult to identify which one fit the criteria that we are using for systematic review. We can also do hand searching. Hand searching if, for example, this is actually doing it manually because not all database have index items that wherein you can find the literature. So sometimes you have to peruse the pages of key journals or conferences, or we can also use cited references. We call it citation chaining. This is like a snowballing wherein, say, you found a literature or a study that is really very relevant in your research question, and then you try to look at the references in the bibliography, and probably say you have 2 or 3 literature that cites the same reference, then that reference could be included as well in your systematic review, because that reference probably is very relevant because it's been cited several times. So is there an international classification searching that is not language dependent? I'm not sure about that, but the searching is language dependent because, for one, The database, of course, are you can only search databases depending on the language. I don't know if you can use images, although I think in the visual arts, they can use images or something. But this is the very reason why when we publish our article, we are asked by the publication, by the journal, to identify 5 or 6 keywords, because those keywords, as they enter them in the database, those are the keywords that yun ba, kumbaga, once they are identified by the researcher, would prompt the researcher to come to your article. So I have not come across with with a searching with any classification searching system that is not language dependent, unfortunately. Okay. So we've mentioned, for example, in doing a study review on this. So how do we develop a search string for this? So for example, where our research question is about, or review question is about, what are the attitudes of health professionals towards caring for older patients with dementia in acute setting? So using PEO, so we identify the population and the problem, the exposure and the outcome. So population, for examples, are health professionals working in an acute setting. Exposure would be caring for older patients with dementia, and the outcomes would be their attitudes. So how do we develop the search string? It might look like this. So acute care or acute setting or hospital. Okay, so all of those truncation or use of Boolean terms or search phrases, we can identify. I don't just have the time, but we could have like later on, you could probably do it in Google Scholar, or if you're using Ovid database, yeah, we can have demonstration for that. Now, you have to report the method you use for searching for your evidences. So you have to keep a detailed record of the methods, okay? So for example, the date when your search was carried out, say, for example, the search in the database was carried out between the period of August to, say, October 2022. Because that means that only those articles published up to that period would have been included. Also, the version of the bibliographic database that you have searched, or the interface used, whether you use Ovid, Dialog, the search terms you've used, complementary search activities if you contacted expert or if you did citation chaining, and the bibliographic software used to search for your studies. So this is an example of the search strategy I used in my systematic review. So I've identified the electronic databases. I've used hand searching and web-based searching. So I have 10 bibliographic databases searched between August to September. And then the search terms, for example, help-seeking behavior or utilization of mental health services or access to mental health services or psychological help-seeking. And so take note of that. Yeah, so that's the search strategy I've used. Once you have identified, because for example, if you're using Ovid, it would tell you like, okay, 3,000, say for example, 3,500 literature or studies relevant to your search strategy have been identified. Of course, it would be difficult to do systematic review of 3,500, plus you do not know whether the 3,500 studies meet your eligibility criteria. So you have to screen the titles and the abstract. Okay. So in screening the titles, you start with screening the titles and the abstract, because imagine if you have to read all the 3,500 studies, that would take a lot of time. So we start with titles and abstract. Unfortunately, you might encounter some articles without an abstract, although that is very rare. So by now you have finalized probably and conducted your main search. So you are ready to screen the studies. based on your eligibility criteria or your inclusion-exclusion criteria. Ideally, when you screen the titles and abstract, you do a pilot test. So when you say pilot test, you do it, for example, say in my case, when I did OVID, and I downloaded the abstract, I think, and the titles and the abstract, I think it's around like 3,000, 3,500. So I had to pilot test my eligibility criteria to the first 10 abstract or 10 titles. So I could check whether, for one, whether I could carry through the screening. And it would also help refine your eligibility criteria. So when we deduplicate the references, there are instances when, for example, that study has been cited or has been included in different databases. And of course, if you're using several databases, they would continuously put that as part of the literature that has been identified. So you have to do away with the duplicates. And as I've said, you develop and pilot your screening and selection tool. Try to do it with probably the first page or the first probably 5 or 10 studies. Then you screen titles and abstract identified against your inclusion-exclusion criteria. For example, because my study is about Filipino migrants, but there are instances wherein the database would even include migrants who are not of Filipino heritage. So obvious yun sa title. For example, help-seeking behavior of Mexican immigrants in the US. Obviously, they are not Filipino immigrants, so you can screen that out based on the title. Sometimes it's not obvious in the title because the title can be very broad, so you go to the abstract. But I suggest you start with the titles first before you go to the abstract. Again, you have to make it systematic. Okay, so once you have screened all the titles and abstract, okay, and again, you have to document this using the Prisma. Later, I'll tell you what the Prisma is. You have to obtain the full text paper. So say, for example, out of the 3,500, after you've screened the titles and the abstract, remove the duplicates. Sometimes you would even come up with merong entry na about an erratum of the art of the study, or what's this, parang letter to the editor about the study. Then you have to remove that. Then the next step would be to obtain the full text paper of potentially eligible references. Sometimes the full text paper of potentially eligible references, you'd come up with, say, 150. That is still quite tedious to read and to screen. So you would make use again of your screening and selection tool to help you identify which of these full text paper would be finally included in your systematic review. Okay. So as I've said, use your inclusion-exclusion criteria. Kaya parang kumbaga the eligibility criteria is some sort of your blueprint or your parang Bible mo siya. I usually would always come back to, okay, is it part of my inclusion criteria? For example, part of my inclusion criteria, if there is a disaggregate report on at least 15% of the participants are Filipinos. So kasi there are certain studies that are multi-ethnic studies, such as, for example, studies conducted in the US, in Canada, wherein they would make one national study of all Asian migrants. So sometimes they would not make, the study would not report actually, or they would just report how many are the participants, but they would not disaggregate the data in terms of, say, how many Filipinos have used mental health services and all that. So that could be part of your eligibility criteria. So we call it screen and select, and there are 2 stages. We do initial screening, as I've said, of the titles and the abstract. And the second screening involves looking closely at the articles by examining the full text. Okay, so when you do the full text screening, again, you have to base it in your inclusion-exclusion criteria, but at the same time, you also have to provide reasons why certain studies or documents have been excluded. Okay. Yeah, so we obtained the full text paper of potentially eligible references. Sometimes some of them are not available online. You may want to contact the author. This happened to me, for example, I had to contact the author. The paper was available, but I needed one data and it's not in her paper, but it's been mentioned in passing. So I had to contact the author. The author was very generous to provide me with the raw data of her study, because authors are really very, very eager to help, especially if you're using their study as part of the systematic review. So once you've completed the screening of titles and abstract, you then need to obtain the copy. You mark, as I've said, for possible inclusion. So you can identify full text paper. And again, this is the second screening. Use your screening and selection tool to identify full text paper finally for inclusion in your study. When you do the screening, so from the first screening of abstract and titles down to the second screening of the full text paper, it is best that you have a collaborator on this. Because sometimes parang, isasama ko ba tong paper na to? Parang, sige na nga. Even if it does not fully meet your eligibility criteria. Also, it helps, especially if you want to narrow down your or maximize your time. I remember, for example, my colleague in the systematic review. So she was doing systematic review on dementia care. And God, she came up with around 9,500 abstracts and titles just for dementia care. And she cannot possibly do it on her own. So she had to have three of us doing the screening. So we have to parang hinati-hati namin, okay, the first 3,000 entries would be, I'll do the screening, the second 3,000 entries by her, and the third by the other collaborator. So that's the reason why we need collaborators. But if it's possible for you to do both, like all the entries, you would both screen and then later on compare what you have come up with. Okay, as I've said, you have to report the result of your searching and screening and selection process. This will form part of the method section of your systematic review. And in fact, this is what makes it really a rigorous method of doing a study and makes it really evidence-based. You have to identify, as I've said, your inclusion-exclusion criteria, the details on method in which you apply them, how, if you had disagreement with your collaborator. And then you also have to report in your results section the references you have identified. Take note that the references or the studies are like your participants in your study if you are in doing systematic review. How many duplicates have been removed, the references you look at when screening for titles, etc. So it would look like this. So we call it the Prisma flow diagram for systematic review. First, you are asked to record, identify. So there are three, if you notice, there are three processes: identification, screening, and what's included, inclusion. So like records identified, how many records were removed, why were they removed, because they were duplicates or they were ineligible, and other reasons. For example, they were erratum or they were letters to the editor. Then how many records were screened after the first screening, and how many again were excluded. And then reports you sought for retrieval meaning you retrieval for full text paper. And then how many have you assessed for final eligibility into your study? What were the reasons why some of the records or some of the studies have been excluded? And how many studies are finally included in your review? Okay, so this is an example of how I did mine. Sorry if it's not very clear. Yeah, so my electronic database, I came up from electronic databases, I came up with 3,600 plus entries, or 3,000 entries. Records identified through database searching was narrowed down to 3,000. Then when duplicates were removed, narrowed down further to 2,000. And then screened via titles. So I've removed the titles, duplicates in the titles, 2,600. And then finally, out of the screening of the titles and the abstract, I came up with 1,162 full text articles. And out of these full text articles, these are the reasons for removing them. I came up with 15 articles. Actually, it's 24 papers. Just so happened that some of the papers or some of the studies are published in several papers. Kasi ginagawa nila yan, especially if it's like a national study. Icha-chop-chop nila yung result and come up with 5, 10 papers. So for example, in the National Latin American Studies in the US, they came up with several papers, so I would include 2 papers, but they are counted as one study. Okay, so once you have, of course, you have selected the study. So kumbaga parang in the research, you have selected your participants. Then you are ready to do the data extraction. Or say, for example, you have selected your participants in a survey or in an interview. Now you are ready to do the interview or the survey. Yun nga lang, if it's in systematic review, dun pa lang sa searching and screening of the articles, madugo na po siya. Unlike if it's a regular literature review wherein you don't have to go through this process, right? But that is what makes systematic review, as I've said, very rigorous study. So the next thing to do is engage in do the data extraction. So data extraction, once you have the final list of the papers, you have finalized them. The next thing to do is to extract the data you need, okay? Depending on, of course, the purpose of your review or the review questions you have set so far. Of course, you will only extract data that are relevant to your research question. It would also require a lot of planning. So in data extraction, you collected for your systematic review. They have to be accurate, complete, of course, accessible. I would recommend that you use a data extraction table. This is usually research design, meaning to say, ikaw yung gagawa nung data extraction table mo. For example, I just cannot show it now. In your data extraction table, for example, say you have 3 outcomes you identified that you need the data. Say my outcome include barriers to help seeking, their attitude towards help seeking, and then their concept of mental health. So I have identified them dun sa table, and then sa different columns would be the different studies and what these different studies, the data from these different studies. So it would be easier for you to later on to do the analysis. I would suggest that if you use a data extraction table, you make sure that this table is comprehensive enough that you don't need to go back every now and then to the study or to the paper. Kasi sometimes it can be tedious. Ano nga ba yung sinabi ng paper na to? Babalikan na naman dun sa paper. So what I did was 2 ways. First, I had to highlight in the paper yung mga information I needed and then put it in the table. So it's easier for me to identify. I even had to put the page number of where I got that data so that when I need to counter check whether my data is accurate, it's easier for me to go back to the paper and find the data immediately. Yeah, so this is actually a summary of the steps in data extraction. First, you identify the data you need to extract. Say if it's descriptive data like study characteristics, okay, then you, similar to screening, you can also pilot your data extraction table. What do I mean by pilot? You say, for instance, you are doing systematic review of, say, 24 papers. That's quite a lot. I'm telling you, even if it's just 24. So what you can do is to pilot the extraction table, data extraction table, to 2 or 3 para makikita mo, does it fit, or does it give me enough information later on when I write the synthesis? Okay. So these are the data that we need to collect. Again, when we talk about data in systematic review, it would be any information derived from the study. So it could be the details of study methods, the participants, the setting, the context, intervention, then the descriptive data such as study characteristics, and of course the analytical data such as the outcome data. So essentially, kaya nga po para siyang, it's like also doing another research, except this time you are not confined to one study setting, but rather to several, even worldwide study settings, because you are not just collating them, but you are putting them together, then doing a synthesis of all these available evidences. That's why it's considered as the highest form of evidence. Because imagine, for example, if I'm a policymaker, I might not have the time to go through all of those studies and read them, come up with a policy or with an intervention. But the systematic review can help me identify which of these intervention, for example, works well, because the systematic review has not just collated, but put together the data of the available data out there. In fact, even when you do your literature review in your thesis, you probably come up with systematic review. When I was doing the literature review of my thesis, I prefer systematic reviews kasi ang hirap na, like, you would be extracting or you would be synthesizing evidences from single study design, or you'd be extracting evidences from one study from, say, from Mexico, one study from Canada, which is, if they are in a systematic review, you just simply say, okay, in a systematic review of 27 paper, this is the result. So it's easier to synthesize. So the data that we need from the studies would be first study characteristics. So para din po yung, you are sort of describing the participants' characteristics, diba? When you describe your participants in your research, you identify the socio-demographic data. So ganun din dito. Except, of course, our participants are the different studies. So what study design have been used, the setting, where and when was it done, for example, the inclusion-exclusion criteria of those studies, what recruitment, sampling procedure was used, whether they have enrollment start and end dates, especially if it's like intervention study, strength of follow-up, methods of use, or the statistical analysis they use, units of analysis, etc. So we have to report them. And then if you are doing a systematic review, for example, that would involve participants, people, for example, then you have to identify the participants in those studies, age, sex, setting, regions, where they come from. For example, in my systematic review, majority of the participants of the 15 studies are women, okay, and they mostly come from the US, from Canada and Australia. Yeah. And then I have, like, when we I put them together, the number of participants is around like 4,500. So imagine you cannot do that in one study. It would be difficult to do a study involving 4,500 participants. But if you do a systematic review, you put together the different studies, it's like, wow, I have like 4,500 in participants in my study. And then if you are doing a systematic review of intervention, then probably you can identify the intervention and the comparators, like if it's an experimental study. And then, of course, the outcomes. So the outcomes are the events, measurement value that you try to observe. For example, the outcomes I'm trying to observe would be the help-seeking behavior, attitude, the barriers to help-seeking, the facilitators of help-seeking, their concept of mental health, their coping strategy, etc. You need to identify as well measurement tool or instrument, because this is also crucial for you to come up with what data analysis technique would you use. Kasi for example, it might be difficult to do meta-analysis if the studies made use of different instruments, different tools, instead of just one. Okay, specific metric, methods of aggregation, like whether they did mean or standard deviation, timing of outcome measurement, etc. Meron po yung, you can find different resources on this. And of course, you have to previously identify this in your protocol. So the results would be the number of participants that have been randomly assigned. So you can also extract data from the results of the study, of course. Summary data for each group, if there is a between group estimates or subgroup analysis, etc. You can also do, you can also include other data, like what's the key conclusion of the author. You may probably, as I've said in my systematic review, there was one missing data from the author, so I had to contact the author and request for that data. So this is an example of the study and participant characteristics I've extracted from the studies included in my systematic review. So the study number, the participants' characteristics, the setting where the study was done, the methodology used in the study, the questionnaire they use, and of course, I'll discuss quality assessment later on. So the quality assessment, because as I've said, this is also what sets systematic review apart from a literature review. You assess the quality of the available evidence or the studies included. Okay. It would be better if you have an easy to use form that you can use to collect sufficient data. As I've said, you can make use of a data extraction table. In my case, I've made one. This would help you minimize the need to go back from the source document, which can be time consuming. So, and it would also sometimes some journals would ask you to make your data collection form available if the peer reviewer would want to go back to your data, because the peer reviewer might have question about your analysis. So, because that's one way of making your systematic review very transparent. So once you have extracted the data, my question po ba, by the way, sorry if I've been talking for long now. We're almost done. We're down to the last two processes. Once you have extracted the data, then you are ready for quality assessment. Sometimes when we say quality assessment, we assess the quality of the studies included. Kasi we want to know whether the studies have been rigorously done. Sometimes quality assessment can be done before data extraction or after data extraction. It depends on you, by the way, as long as you can justify why you did it that way. So quality assessment is assessing the degree in which the study employs measure to minimize bias and error. You do this so that you would be confident that the study, the design and the conduct of the study is robust, and the results can be, you are confident that the results are trustworthy and generalizable. Remember that systematic review is on top of the list of the evidence, gold standard for evidence. And as I've said, this can be done before, during, or while you are doing data extraction process, or even after. There's no hard rule on this when you would have to do this, as long as you have to do this, because you also have to report this. Although we might come to think like, oh, hindi naman yan mapapublish if it's not a rigorous study. That's not very true. Okay, sometimes they can get published. We don't take published studies at face value. We have to delve deeper. That is your role as an investigator. You need to know whether there are flaws, there are inherent weaknesses in those studies. So you can distinguish between what is good and poor quality studies. And therefore, that can also help you come up with a meaningful conclusion and meaningful data. Now, why would you do it before or after? If, for example, you only come up with 15 studies, and that's not very much. So I would suggest you do it after. But if you have, for example, like 50 studies, that's still quite a lot, and you want to only include those studies that meet the quality standards, the quality assessment, then you should do the quality assessment before data extraction. Because that way you can still justify, oh, I'm not including this study because it does not meet the quality I've set on the screening of on the quality assessment. So pwede pang mabawasan yung studies or paper. Yeah, so once you have gathered your included studies, you need to appraise the evidence for its relevance, reliability, validity, and applicability. This is why we do quality assessment. For example, does the study, is the research method used in the study appropriate to answering the research question that the author identified? Are the specific inclusion-exclusion criteria used? In terms of reliability, is the effect size practically relevant? How precise is the estimate effect? All that. Validity, applicability, I cannot go in detail of this. But these are the 4 reasons why we are doing quality assessment. Okay, so we want to rule out in quality assessment the selection bias, the allocation bias, detection bias, even attrition bias, and reporting bias. Kaya even if it's RCT, we say RCT is a gold standard, but it can have a reporting bias. However, that is already in systematic review, natatanggal natin yan na we are able to rule that out, or we are able to check whether a certain study has that kind of weaknesses. There are different assessment tools, quality assessment tools you can use out there, so you don't need to identify to make your own. It depends on the type of studies that you expect to see in your results. So say, for example, the type of studies included in your systematic review are, say, RCT, cohort studies, or say qualitative studies. So yeah, just to give you an example, this one, critical appraisal skills program, it has the list of the different, wait, let me share my screen on that. It has the list of the different quality assessment tool you can use. For instance, you're doing a systematic review of a systematic review. Pwede din pong mangyari yan. Kasi halimbawa, there are already like several systematic reviews conducted on that particular topic, and you want to synthesize further the evidence. or you're doing systematic review, the nature of the nature of the studies included in your systematic reviews are qualitative study, then you can use this one. Let me just show you. So these are this is the appraisal tool. So does the study have a clear statement of the aims? Is the qualitative methodology appropriate? The research design appropriate to address the research question? So imagine you are not just extracting data from these studies, but you are also assessing the quality of these studies. So that's why that makes it really rigorous. Okay, let me go back to my slides. Baka po may tanong. Okay, so just to summarize the steps in quality assessment, again, you have to take note of the design of the studies included, because the assessment tool would depend on the type of the study design. Okay, and then identify the type of quality assessment tools you need for your review. Yung CASP or CASP, it has different tools. Marami po yan. It's available in the internet. And the good thing is that you can use them as long as you cite them. Kasi the idea is yung ano natin, common, we want to share information. Then we choose the appropriate quality assessment tool. We carry out the quality assessment tool, tabulate and summarize the result, and think about the results, how it might impact your conclusion. It would be best to do quality assessment with the collaborator. Although minsan your collaborator may not have the time to do it. So, but it's best. So sometimes you might have a different collaborator when you are doing screening of the abstract and titles. You might have a different collaborator in the second screening of the full text paper. And you might have a different collaborator in the quality assessment. That's fine, as long as you also include them as authors in your paper, and you cite there, because some journals, by the way, would ask what were the contributions of each of these author. So okay lang po yan. So once you have done your quality assessment, you are ready for your data synthesis. So data synthesis meaning, so you have extracted the data and you are confident that the data you extracted, because the studies included, meet the quality assessment criteria you have set, then you are confident that your data would yield significant result. So you're ready to do the synthesis. So you bring together the findings from these different studies so you can draw conclusion. So you can do either quantitative data synthesis or narrative. If you do quantitative data synthesis, you use meta-analysis. That's why meta-analysis is actually one of also the best, the gold standard for evidence. Or you do narrative synthesis. In my case, I had to do narrative synthesis because, for one, the studies were quite heterogeneous. It's difficult to find a commonality even in the measurement tools they use. Like, they use different tools to measure attitude on help seeking, different tools on measuring help seeking behavior. So it would be difficult to compare if I'm using meta-analysis. So I have to do narrative synthesis. I will not go into the detail of the meta-analysis. I'm not confident in meta-analysis because sometimes the meta-analysis you can do like it's like different statistical tools. But in narrative synthesis, it's also similar to meta-analysis because you can develop a theory of how the intervention works. And unfortunately, the theory building aspect is something that is neglected in systematic review. Okay, for example, meta-analysis have focused too much on establishing the causation of the different variables and very little on explanatory theories. But actually systematic review, whether you are doing, whether the studies are qualitative or quantitative research, they are more powerful than a single study. So you can develop a theory on this. You can also use systematic review to develop the preliminary synthesis of findings included in your studies. You can interrogate the preliminary synthesis, identify factors, for example, that influence the result, and construct your own explanation of how, for example, or why that intervention has worked. Okay, and you can also explore relationship in the data within and between studies. So it's not just, as I've said, you're not just looking at one study, but several studies. So you can probably like identify factors that would explain differences or understand how and why the intervention work on a particular people and not on the others and all that. And then, of course, you can assess the robustness of the synthesis. So once you have done your synthesis, you are now ready to write your manuscript. And systematic reviews follow the same structure of an original research article. It also has a title, abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion, section, and conclusion. So the abstract, of course, would give you an overview of what the systematic review is. And you have to write the abstract well, because remember that the abstract is really quite important for other researchers to direct them to your research. The introduction is basically setting the rationale for the review, why you are doing the review, and the research review questions you have identified. The methods, actually, by the time you write your research protocol, up to the methods meron ka na. Then you just refine the method section once you are done. The method section would include the eligibility criteria, as I've said, what database you used to search, what search strategy was used, yung Prisma diagram. And then the results are done, like how many articles, the study characteristics, the participants characteristics, the outcomes characteristics. But of course, the best part would be the discussion. So the discussion section is the main findings summarizing your review, how the findings would fit together in your research, whether they, say, for example, whether they contradict common practice or they contradict the national policy, or do they support a theory. And then you also can probably in your discussion, you can also come up with like whether the findings can be generalized to other population, whether the results would apply to, say, for example, all migrants. And then, of course, you also have to identify the strength and the limitation of the included studies. For example, one of the limitation of the included studies I've made in my systematic review is that most of them are descriptive cohort studies. So only one was about intervention. And then the implications of the review, whether it has some implication in the clinical, educational, research policy, what research direction would you recommend for future researchers and all that. I was about to say something, sorry. So it's really important to be honest in terms of the strength and limitations of your systematic review. Sometimes I read some systematic reviews na parang hard sell, like, oh, these are the strengths, and they forget to identify the limitations. It's best to identify the limitations because it would also direct other researchers on what to avoid later on. So lastly, why do we do systematic review? There are certain advantages and certain limitations. As we've said, it can help limit bias, draw reliable and accurate conclusion, deliver required information, especially to healthcare providers, researchers, policymakers. It can also help reduce the time delay in the research discovery, kasi sometimes, especially if it's like a treatment, intervention, or they are trying to discover the effect of a particular, say, treatment or drugs or therapy. So sometimes it would take a while before all of these studies are synthesized or are made available in the literature. So if the systematic review would cover even, for example, clinical reports of these studies, then that would help make it more systematic. However, the limitations are that, as I've said, they are considered best evidence for getting a definitive answer to your research questions, but there are inherent flaws, such as location selection of the studies. As I've said, most of the studies published, especially if you're using published literature, they are mostly done in Western countries. And sometimes they can be so heterogeneous that it's difficult to do meta-analysis. Or sometimes some of the information have been lost, or there are inappropriate subgroup analyses, or there could be conflict in the experimental data, and then duplication of publication. Duplication of publication, as I've mentioned, for example, there was this National Latin American and Asian Studies in the US conducted early 2000, and they came up with more than 10 publications. So if you're not careful, parang you would report this study separately when actually these are just one studies. So just to probably end the discussion, I'd like to quote Einstein, who said, if we knew what it was we were doing, it would not be called research, would it? So yeah, you might encounter challenges in doing systematic review, but still I would encourage you to engage in systematic review. You can help other researchers, especially in synthesizing the available evidence out there. So thank you, and if you have questions, so feel free to ask.
So this is the certificate of appreciation, of very deep appreciation for Dr. Andrea Martinez for her contribution as a resource speaker to the graduate lecture, how to write a systematic literature review. This is signed again by the Vice President for Higher Education, Dr. Juliet Dalagan, and also the University President, Father Mars Pitan of the Society of Jesus. Okay, thank you, Dr. Andrea. Again, let's give a heart to Dr. Andrea.